Good morning, good evenings of distinguished panelists. We should start. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, so let's start. And this is the 5th annual China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum 2020. So this having here at the UPenn China Center to starting this 5th annual China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum. So at the opening panel, we actually invited a very distinguished, very senior think tank experts from the United States. I would like to introduce them, and then I will give that to James McGann to moderate. First, I would like to introduce our distinguished participant of this panel this morning. James McGann, Director of Think Tanks and Civil Society Program, University of Pennsylvania. He's joining us from United States. And then we have the distinguished panelists. We have Emma Ashford, Resident Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council. We have David Dollar, Senior Fellow, Brookings Institution. We have Paul Haenle, Director, Carneigie-Tshinghua Center for Global Policy. We have Ikenson, Director of the Center for Trade Policy Studies, Cato Institute. We have Terry Miller, Director of the Center for International Trade and Economics, Heritage Foundation. And myself, I'm the President and Founder and President, Center for China and Globalization. So most of you have actually attended the China Global Think Tank Summit forum actually in the past. I would like to introduce the moderator of this. Actually, as a matter of fact, Jim's going to give us an opening talk. So I would like to have Jim to give us opening talk, and then we'll have Jim to conduct the first panel. So Dr. Jim McGann is no stranger to the Chinese think tank community. He's the director of Think Tank Civil Society Program, University of Pennsylvania, and also a very senior expert on international think tanks. He directed the program at the University of Pennsylvania, which focused on the role of policy research institutions around the world in government and private organizations. It now has a database of almost 7,000 think tanks in 160 countries around the world, and works in cooperating with a partnership with many think tanks around the world. At the same time, it published a global think tank ranking report with international impact every year, which is also the host of the global think tank development report of the University of Pennsylvania. And James has actually this year has organized a number of global think tanks summit and regional think tank summit, and we are very pleased that Jim is also collaborating with us in organize this 5th China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum. So as you are the leader of the global think tank community, we would like to have you have the opening talk. So Dr. McGann, your turn, please.
Henry, thank you very much. I want to welcome everyone from China and around the world to the 5th China Think Tank Innovation Forum. Over 10 years ago, I co-organized the first think tank forum in Beijing, and then in Shanghai and Hong Kong. And for the last 5 years with the Center for China and Globalization. As you may know, I edit the annual Global Go-To Think Tank Index and maintain a database of over 9,000 think tanks around the world. More about this and recent developments in China. I'm committed to conducting research, engaging scholars, and building partnerships with think tanks, because dialogue, partnerships, and cooperation in the face of many complex global challenges we face is essential. This is why think tanks in China and in the US and around the world matter, and matter more than ever before. And that is why we must work to make sure that think tanks are fit for an uncertain future, which is part of our objective with this forum today. The think tank's innovation forum focuses on the challenges facing think tanks in China and across the globe. As think tanks, we must face the reality that there will be no new normal, only a series of extraordinary events that will create a world where disruptions and the abnormal will be the norm. Big ships turn slowly and sink quickly in storms, so only the innovative and agile will survive this COVID storm. The themes of all the past forums have taken on greater meaning and importance today because their focus was on the necessity to rethink the traditional business model for think tanks. The imperative is now more urgent since the winds of change have intensified and accelerated the trends I will outline to you this morning. Only those think tanks that are smarter, better, faster, tech savvy, agile will be able to weather the storm. The mission of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program at the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania is to help think tanks be prepared to survive this storm so they can continue to serve in the post-COVID era. My hope is that think tanks in China will join the global community of think tanks and help strengthen think tanks not only in China, but around the world. Over the last 10 years, I've been examining the forces that have transformed the policy environment in which think tanks operate and have forced them to redefine their strategy and structure. These forces are primarily driven by changes in politics, how think tanks are funded, advances in technology and communication. Over the last decade, there are 4 key trends that flow from the 4th industrial revolution that will transform all our jobs and lives over the next 10 years. It is these forces that are also driving the digital and political disruptions that are sweeping across the globe. These 4 principal trends are the disruptive power of social media, artificial intelligence, and big data. Secondly, the dramatic increase in the rate of technological change. Fourthly, global information interdependence, and finally, the increased velocity of information and policy flows, which is made possible by the first 3. Digital and social networks that are constantly being enhanced by new strategies and technologies, which in turn increase both the volume and velocity of information flows around the world. These new realities are making it possible to manage and manipulate massive amounts of data, which is disrupting business, politics, and public policy. Henry Kissinger, which people in China know well and follow closely, famously said that being a policymaker is like being at the end of a fire hose, which for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is a high pressure, high volume hose that is used to fight fires. And the basic image is that there's so much information coming into a policymaker's office that it is hard to manage that flow of information. Today, we are all at the end of a fire hose, and information is coming at us from every direction and every hour of the day. Policymakers and the public are faced with a flood of issues, ideas, actors, which has served to intensify competition, conflict, and to a certain extent, cooperation. This never-ending flood, of competing ideas and information makes it difficult to process all the different ideas, options, and alternatives. How do we determine which product or policy is the best one? It is no surprise that in this environment, traditional approaches in terms of ideas and information are overlooked for the outrageous and the outlandish. These forces, have created a crowded and competitive global marketplace of ideas and policy advice. This poses very new and very challenging strategic and operational challenges for think tanks. In the last 4 years, these trends that I've outlined above have been compounded by two new forces that have intensified and accelerated the winds of change and are likely to transform think tanks' policy advice and public policy itself in ways that we previously could not imagine. One is the effort to discredit and undermine experts, policy advice, and think tanks. And the second is the COVID-19 pandemic. These two additional trends have accelerated and compounded the transformation that is taking place and will force all think tanks to respond. The dawn of the fourth industrial revolution is upon us and will require think tanks to manage change, access policy issues and trends, and make recommendations more quickly than ever before. The pandemic has intensified those operational requirements. Never have think tanks of all types and size felt so much pressure to rethink how they operate to fit changing requirements. The COVID-19 pandemic and the increased velocity of information and policy flows will continue to accelerate. Factors like digitalization, globalization, automation, and analytics. What this means is that think tanks must become, as I have suggested earlier, smarter, better, faster, and more digital and more adaptive and agile if they have any hope of surviving. Think tanks must rethink how they think about policy and policy advice. I will now turn to a few remarks about China and the data that we have collected. For many years, there has been almost no data about the number and type of think tanks in China. In fact, the numbers vary widely. We have spent the last 6 months in an intensive data collection, updating the entire global TTCSP database, and have had an intensive effort in collecting data in China. There are now over 9,000 think tanks that are in our database, and we have collected in a very systematic way and identified 1,415 think tanks in China. This reflects a dramatic increase in the number of think tanks in China and constitutes the most significant number of think tanks among the think tank leaders or leader countries in Asia, India, Korea, Japan, Australia, and Vietnam. Over 600 think tanks have been established in China since 2000. While we have extensive data on 2,500 think tanks from around the world, meaning staff size, budget size, description of their programs, which institutions in every region have readily provided us, there are many blanks, many gaps in the information that we have on Chinese think tanks. specifically on staffing, size, budget, and even basic information about their research program. This is a huge information gap, and the missing information highlights the lack of transparency surrounding the nature and operation of think tanks in China. Thirdly, the number of think tanks, or the largest number of think tanks, is still in Beijing, outnumbering the rest of think tanks proportionally in every other city in China. There are, as I said, 500 think tanks in Beijing, which makes up about 1/3 of the think tanks in China. It makes sense because China is Beijing is the political center, but more cities need to be put and create think tanks to help them with their regional and provincial issues. Areas for improvement. First, the vast majority of think tanks in China do not have functional websites. And those that do, they are not updated on any regular basis. Scholars and research programs are not listed, and there are no contacts for key staff and scholars. The majority of think tanks do not have an English, their websites in both Chinese or Mandarin and English, or for that matter, in any other language. So if the aspiration is to create great think tanks in China and to have influence around the world, English and multilingual websites are essential. Next, and one of the last two I think are fundamental and require attention for the reform and modernization of think tanks in China. One, the lack of access to data by scholars at think tanks undermines the credibility of what is produced. Many scholars at think tanks in China regularly complain that ministries and other government agencies, they have little or no access to the critical data that they need for their research. Finally, there is a severe lack of adherence to basic social science research standards, meaning access to data, ability to replicate studies that are produced. All of these basic, universal, internationally accepted standards are not practiced or adhered to in China, and that needs to change if Chinese think tanks are to be smarter, better, faster, and to have both national, regional, and global impact. Several key points in a broader context that will influence all think tanks as a result of COVID-19. As I've alluded to, the disruptive and transformative dimensions of this crisis will have and will continue to alter all aspects of our lives and livelihoods. We will not return to a new normal or any normal after this crisis. It is so transformative. The crisis has become the great accelerator, transformer, and terminator. What I mean by that is changes are accelerated, institutions are transformed, and many institutions will cease to exist as a result of this pandemic. 25 to 30% of certain organizations, private enterprises, and think tanks will close and not reopen. At a time when governments will face huge and decimated budgets while facing rising social, political, and economic challenges. Those institutions that have taken steps, and this is important and the key message for think tanks in China, those institutions that have taken steps to modernize their operations and implement digital and other strategies are more likely to survive the crisis. Key sectors such as higher education, medicine, travel and leisure, and information-based organizations will be most adversely affected. This crisis and the economic impact is different than past economic downturns because in the past, the negative economic impact of a downturn during the oil crisis, the dot-com bust, the 2008 economic crisis, hit both the rich and the middle class at about the same level, albeit differently. The COVID-19 crisis has widened the gap and created a huge gap between rich and poor that is likely to have long-term and destabilizing effects in countries around the world. Like all great wars, this crisis will create a global power shift. And China at the moment seems to be the only country, ironically, that is emerging from this crisis in a commanding economic position, which is likely to have global and geopolitical impact. Finally, and most importantly, this is a wake-up call for all organizations to accelerate the modernization and reform, if for no other reason than their very survival may depend on it. Every organization must have as its goal to be smarter, better, faster, more agile, and more digital. After hearing what I just said, you might think I am a pessimist, that is, or a defeatist, or both. But no, I'm a pragmatist that believes that in every challenge there is an opportunity. And if we come together as a community of think tanks and innovate and cooperate, we will beat this invisible beast and be better for it. Thank you all very much. And we now turn to the opening panel. And I would say one could not imagine at the most appropriate time to have such a stellar panel that will address the foreign policy challenges facing the Obama administration and what think tanks can do to help shape that foreign policy. I'll just tick off a few, and our panelists, I'm sure, will address some or many of these. One is Hong Kong, a clear challenge that will be front and center in the Biden administration. SALT, the Uyghurs, the South China Sea, trade, 5G, competition, human rights, and the Orwellian steps that have been taken in China in terms of managing or controlling the population, all of which have wide-ranging implications and intersect with two countries that are in deep competition and with people that are on this panel will help manage that in a very difficult and turbulent period. So without further ado, I will turn over to the panel. And since Henry has introduced everyone, we'll get right to the program. So first, Emma Ashford from the Atlantic Council, if you would open up with your remarks.
Great, thanks, Jim. So thanks to everybody for being here. I'm really pleased to be able to join what promises to be an interesting panel. So just to, I guess, introduce myself a little bit to tell you what I do at the Atlantic Council. I'm a senior fellow in the New American Engagement Initiative, which is a program located inside the Scowcroft Center. And our mandate is to think long-term about strategy for the United States. And in particular, inside the New American Engagement Initiative, our mandate is to think about challenging the assumptions that underlie American foreign policy. So if you've ever heard of the notion of a red team in business that sort of examines assumptions, pushes back on common wisdom, that is what NAEI is supposed to do for US foreign policy and strategy. We're supposed to test assumptions, look long-term at strategy, and think about where the US is headed over the next few decades, not necessarily about the problems that we face tomorrow. And so that's kind of where we sit in the think tank ecosystem. So with regard to COVID-19, so they asked us to talk a little about COVID-19 and then about the Biden administration. With regard to COVID-19, that sort of approach and where we sit informs some of the work that we've been doing on how America, not just how America has responded to the pandemic over the last 9 months, but how the pandemic might impact American power potential and American foreign policy going forward. So I was recently involved in a collaboration with a couple of European think tanks, the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Italy, a couple of German think tanks, to look at how COVID-19 affects American power. And what we found is that it's had fairly minimal impacts on military readiness, so that's good. That thus far the pandemic has not negatively impacted the bases of American power or the conduct of American foreign policy, but that there is a long tail risk there that if the economy does not recover quickly from the pandemic, or in particular, if we see the economy continue to bifurcate into what they're describing as a K-shaped economic recovery, where some of the economy recovers and some of the economy doesn't, then there could be a more serious impact on America's ability to fund its defense, and in particular to keep the economy sustainable and strong in a way that actually supports American foreign policy long term. There's also a strong trade-off. More stimulus may make the economy recover faster in the short term, but it will also add to the deficit, which has long-term political impacts and may lead to more governance problems. So COVID-19 has not yet impacted American power and American foreign policy negatively, but that potential is there. And so in our role as sort of looking out over the next few decades, this is some of the work that we've done on the pandemic. On the Biden administration, and I think as of this evening, it has been certified that we're definitely having a Biden administration, so that's some good news. The Biden administration represents, I think, a return to what some people are describing as normal in American foreign policy, a return to the American liberal internationalist approach to the world that has characterized US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Now, this also carries with it all of the flaws of that approach to the world. So the idea that it doesn't take rising powers like China or India seriously enough, the idea that it's perhaps over-reliant on an ever-expanding set of alliances, and the fact that it is very expensive, difficult to maintain, particularly with regard to US primacy. So even though a Biden administration, the Biden campaign was very clear in its documents and its speeches that they intend to try to return to the pre-Donald Trump normal, that's going to be very challenging to do. In particular, they're going to face huge headwinds in the context of the legacies of Donald Trump's administration, in things like the newly partisan nature of foreign policy, in trade wars, in dealing with the pandemic, and in some of the longer term legacies of US foreign policy, like the failed war on terror, the fact the US has still not managed to effectively withdraw from Afghanistan. So all of these things are problems for the incoming Biden team, and while they may hope or try to return to the pre-Trump foreign policy, it seems pretty unlikely that they're going to be able to do so in this changing world. And just, I think, with regard to think tanks, that the one piece of good news is a Biden administration is going to be substantially more competent and prepared for governance than the Trump administration was, and that means a return to some of the negatives, right? A return to the revolving door between think tanks and the administration, but it equally means a return to expertise. The Biden administration is going to draw on the expertise that's present in the think tank community, and this means that we are looking at a return to policy disagreements rather than disagreements over personality or controversy, corruption, tweeting, all the things that we saw in the Trump administration. So I think that's a note of optimism to end my remarks on. I think you're muted.
Can you comment on the how, and in specific instances where policy between U.S. and China will change or not change?
I think we're going to see some areas of, I think we're going to see some areas of change between Trump and Biden. I think we're going to see some areas of continuity. And I think that the areas of continuity are likely to be US-China relations. I don't think that Biden is going to necessarily maintain all of the trade wars. I suspect that some of my colleagues on this panel who actually work on trade can probably answer this better than I can. But it does seem pretty clear when you look at who Biden is appointing to senior positions, what they've written on this topic, that we are continuing with this great power competition approach to China, that Washington has very much turned to a more confrontational approach to China. So I don't see a huge difference in how the Biden campaign, Biden administration is going to conduct their China policy.
All right. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is David Dollar from the Brookings Institution.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join the panel. I'm an economist. I'm a senior fellow in the China Center at the Brookings Institution. And I'd like to make 3 points about think tanks in the Biden era, primarily aimed at my own country, the United States, but I think these points have relevance for our Chinese friends as well. So the first point I want to make is that I think it's extremely important to have a wide variety of think tanks with diversities of views, with open debate, and I think that's a very healthy aspect of the United States. So we've already started to talk about how Biden's policy toward China might change. What the US policy should be is a hotly debated issue among Washington think tanks and beyond Washington to other think tanks. In the case of Brookings, we've just put out a collection of essays on US-China relations, and this was done together with the China Center at Yale Law School. So I think we see a lot of healthy collaborations. Brookings has a collaboration with the American Enterprise Institute, and I think this is very healthy. As far as what we say on China, there are about 14 essays, if I remember correctly. So at the risk of oversimplification, there will certainly be areas where US-China relations change dramatically from the Trump administration, simply because the US is going to rejoin the Paris Accord, it's going to rejoin the World Health Organization, it's going to participate more in the international community. And so that means that the US and China, at least in a multilateral setting, will be cooperating on carbon reduction. We're probably going to see a wave of debt crises in developing countries, and the US and China are going to have to cooperate because China is the largest creditor and the US is the largest shareholder in the International Monetary Fund. Now, there are also likely to be areas where there's very little change. We have serious disagreements about security issues, including the South China Sea. We have differences on human rights issues. Biden will probably put more emphasis on human rights issues than the outgoing administration. So there will be areas where the two countries have disagreements, and that will not be that different. I think economics, interestingly enough, kind of falls in the middle. There's the potential for economic relations between US and China to be much better, but it's going to take a lot of effort to realize that. I think many Chinese friends are assuming that the Biden administration will undo a lot of the Trump economic policies toward China. That's probably not true in the first year of the administration. I think the Biden team will be waiting, and particularly they'll be seeing what China is doing. And this is where having more think tanks, more independent debate in China would be healthy. The Chinese leaders keep talking about opening up and reform, but you need to work out the specific details and actually implement it. And I think the US is going to be waiting to see, does China really open up its economy more? In that case, there's going to be potential to get rid of those tariffs and restore economic relations. But if China is obstructionist, then we may find economic relations are really not that different. So I think that is definitely up in the air. That was really the main point I wanted to make, but the other 2 points quickly. Second point, I think it's very healthy to get fresh blood into think tanks. What I value at Brookings is we have a lot of young scholars. Some of them are scholars in training who come as research assistants, but I'm also thinking about young PhDs who have some kind of fellowship, some kind of funding to come and spend time, postdoctoral fellowship. So we get some young up-and-coming scholars. Great to have their fresh point of view. And then picking up on Emma's point, I think the revolving door is a positive. Of course, I'm a participant. I came from the Obama administration and joined Brookings. You probably saw the Wall Street Journal today reported that my Brookings colleague, Janet Yellen, is going to be nominated as Treasury Secretary. So I think we're going to see a lot of expertise coming out of Washington think tanks and going into the US government. And I view that as basically a healthy thing. I've worked on China for quite a few decades. I don't even want to talk about how many decades. I've worked with a lot of really competent Chinese officials, and it strikes me that in retirement, many of them become they become invisible in retirement. So I would encourage China to get your Liu Mingkongs and Zhou Xiaochuan. These are the people I know in the economic realm. They should continue to be active, doing research in think tanks, writing their memoirs. I think that's very valuable. And then the third point I want to make, very important for me, is that international cooperation is a key part of think tank activity in the United States. And in my case, I have partnerships with quite a few different countries in Europe and in Asia. Earlier this year, I put out a book called China 2049, which was written together with economists at Peking University, looking at the important reform agenda out till 2049. And I have to say, I worry that the environment for collaborating between the US and China is deteriorating. Part of this, of course, is the coronavirus, though events like this show that we can stay in touch over the internet, and I participate in a lot of these kind of meetings. But even before the COVID crisis, it was getting harder to get visas. One recent year, all I could get was like a 1 year, one entry visa to China. You know, I've been doing research on China for decades and don't understand why it has to be so difficult. And I worry it's just going to get more difficult coming out of the crisis. And in this current atmosphere, we need more communication, joint research, joint development of data, all of these things. And I worry that both governments are going in the wrong direction. So let me just wrap up there by emphasizing the importance of having a diversity of views in a wide range of think tanks. Good to get fresh blood in and out in various ways so we don't have the same tired people making the policy recommendations. And international cooperation is really key, and it is becoming more controversial, particularly between the United States and China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. The reason why we all do this, and I would point out the number of think tanks in the US and the participants on this panel are eager to cooperate and to engage in China, and your comments underscore that point. Now turn to Paul Haenle, who is the director of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace China Center. Paul?
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you to Henry for inviting me to participate. Last year, I believe I was there in person, and this year, coming in over Zoom, it's a sign of the times.
Yeah.
I'd like to touch on three things. which we were asked to touch on. First, how have we adapted to COVID and trying to continue to make an impact. Second, what the Biden administration means for U.S. think tanks and those of us in Beijing in terms of think tanks. And Carnegie-Tshinghua Center is based in Beijing, so I'll include ours in that group. And for U.S.-China, and I'll talk a little bit, that's my area of expertise. I served as White House China Director in the National Security Council for both President Bush and President Obama. Here I can tell you that unlike the foreign policy areas that Emma talked about, where you may see a return to a pre-Trump policy, I don't think we're going to see that as both Emma and David mentioned. When it comes to U.S.-China policy, I think we're going to see something different that we saw pre-Trump, and I can talk about that. And then finally, what roles do think tanks, and especially those in China, what role can they play in helping to improve the U.S.-China relationship? Because frankly, it's in a pretty bad state of affairs right now. So first on COVID, Carnegie-Tshinghua Center is a partnership between the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and Tsinghua University in Beijing, the International Relations Department. We serve as a platform for constructive dialogue, for cooperation, and for research between Chinese, American, and international experts. Obviously, COVID-19 presented us with some challenges, but also with some opportunities to be creative and to be innovative in how we use technology, how we move online, do things virtually, and also dealing with the disruption of having our staff all around the world. Many of our American staff returned to the United States, and our Chinese staff returned in China. And so at first, I will say we thought about how do we bridge between pre-COVID and post-COVID, just creating a bridge where we could operate in the interim. We realized very quickly we're never going to get back to that normal as it was pre-COVID. And the kind of innovative and creative ways that we are adapting to doing things, whether online or virtually and other ways using different digital platforms, that this will in many ways set the new norm going forward. And we realized that very quickly, and we began to think about it very differently. In terms of our operational impact, the motto that we have at the Carnegie-Tshinghua Center is to stay multi-flexi-changeable. The maximum amount of flexibility, working across different time zones, shifting our calls and meetings to be virtual, trying to maintain office camaraderie and cohesiveness with our staff, despite being so far apart. And I think we've done a pretty good job. In terms of development issues, which we were asked to talk about, it's interesting. I know think tanks face a lot of funding pressures in today's environment. And we certainly have, some obligations as well at Carnegie-Tshinghua Center. I think the one thing that was most helpful in my particular case, when I joined the Carnegie Endowment in 2010 and moved to Beijing to start the partnership with Tsinghua and build the Carnegie-Tshinghua Center, I did not have any funding obligation in the first couple of years. And I built the center with the team, including our partners at Tsinghua, in the way that we thought it should be built to have the greatest impact and to work on the most important issues. And then after two and a half years, we went out to raise money, but we felt that we had built it in the right way. And as a result, I think we were actually able to make a more appealing pitch to our funders. We have today a diverse set of funders, which we think is very important in terms of diversifying your funding base, just like you would diversify your own investment portfolio. We have grant-giving organizations, we have the corporate community, and we have high net worth individuals, both in the United States and in China, because we think it's important for both Americans and Chinese to have skin in the game, given that we focus quite a bit of our attention on the U.S.-China relationship. And this, coupled with the fact that the Carnegie Endowment has an endowment, and that is we are still operating using the funds that come from the interest of the initial donation in 1910 of Andrew Carnegie, and about half of our operational funds come from the interest from that donation. After the pandemic, we focused very much on how do we continue to engage with our donors, letting them know how we have shifted our programming due to COVID, that we intended to maintain our impact, that we would need, discussing what we would need to do in terms of shifting funding around to try to have funding more unrestricted if possible, and having those good, close relationship with funders and donors, and having a demonstrated track record made these conversations easier for us. And as a result, we haven't really had any negative impact on funding during the COVID-19. In terms of research, COVID-19 had a pretty significant impact on the dialogue between Chinese, American, and international experts, especially in the US context, where official dialogues had been abandoned by the Trump administration. And so we had felt that through our think tank channels, creating those track 2 opportunities was very, very important, and even more important. And we focused our efforts during COVID and in the midst of the presidential campaign, which was pretty anti-China in sentiment. We focused those track 2 efforts around how do the US and China work together to prevent irretrievable damage to the US-China relationship in advance of the presidential election in the fall. And, among many efforts that we had, 2 specific efforts I'll raise. One was a track 2 between Madame Fuyin and her center at Tsinghua University, and a U.S. delegation led by President Bush's former National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley. And here we looked this summer at the 5 most, working with Yale China as well, David, I forgot to mention that. We worked on the 5 most contentious issues in the relationship over the summertime: Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea, decoupling, and disputes over COVID-19. We had virtual calls every week after our initial set of dialogue to hammer out an agreed set of joint recommendations that we shared with officials in Beijing and in Washington, and hopefully had some impact. We now are partnering with the Asia Society and the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies on another effort in the wake of Biden's election. We hope to create a set of trilateral dialogues between the United States, China, and then other partners in Europe, Middle East, Russia, and India. With Biden set to enter the White House in January, I think we're going to see a change both in terms of the administration's approach to the relationship, but also in terms of engagement with the think tank community. And that will be a welcome change. It was difficult to engage officials in the Trump administration, not because, there are officials throughout the different departments and agencies that are certainly willing to engage. The question was how much was that kind of work and those kind of insights welcomed at the highest levels. Very, very unclear. But in terms of the changes, I think first and foremost, in terms of the US-China relationship, I think we're going to see a change in tone, a movement away from very hostile, reckless kind of rhetoric that we have seen from the Trump administration, and a renewed focus on trying to balance both the competitive elements of the US-China relationship with some of the cooperative opportunities in the relationship. US competition, I think, in this context will be a lot less about the existential Cold War threat that China poses as described by the Trump administration, and more, I think, about reinvigorating US competitive advantages at home across the spectrum. This is more about, instead of trying to slow China down, trying to run faster ourselves, I think is a nice way to put it. Second, I would expect a return, as David Dollar had mentioned, to a more multilateral approach by the Biden administration, trying to revitalize their participation in key forum like the WHO and the Paris Accords, WTO, perhaps the Iran nuclear agreement, And I would include in this bucket revitalizing our engagement with key U.S. allies, both in Asia and in Europe. Third, I think, and this is a process one, but I think it will be important for U.S.-China, is a restoration of the interagency process, similar to what David was talking about, more of a reliance on experts, more akin perhaps to what we saw in the Obama administration. I think in this context, cabinet secretaries will have much more influence on policymaking than perhaps what we saw in the Trump administration. Even assistants to those cabinet secretaries, and then officials, at every level. And I think they will be more empowered to engage their Chinese counterparts and have much more, be able to speak more authoritatively, because I think they will be part of both the formulation of policy, but also the execution of that policy. And the final point, I think, is, as I mentioned earlier, especially important for think tanks, is that think tanks are likely to be called on much more to advise on issues related to U.S.-China. And this is a real opportunity for all of us. And an important aspect which we've discussed is the revolving door. David Dollar mentioned Janet Yellen. Jake Sullivan, who is going to be the National Security Advisor, is going to be coming out of the Carnegie Endowment, where he spent his time after leaving the Obama administration. Jen Psaki will probably serve in a very senior communications role. John Kerry has been with the Carnegie Endowment since leaving the Obama administration. He's going to go in as the energy czar. So clearly the revolving door is alive and active at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I want to close by talking about what I think this means for think tanks in China, and I'll include the Carnegie-Tshinghua Center in that, and other Chinese think tanks that are at the center of U.S.-China relations. I do expect the Biden administration to change some of their policies. I don't think they will reset to a pre-Trump era U.S.-China relationship. I think that the framing for the relationship will be strategic competition. And I think an important question the Biden administration will try to answer is how to leverage some of the shifts in policy to better balance, as I mentioned, better balance competition and cooperation. In other words, can we be both a strategic competitor with China and a strategic cooperator? I do think, though, that the Biden administration will be under some pressure, especially if Senate remains a Republican majority. A bipartisan consensus on the challenges that China represents are pretty significant in Congress. Unfavorable views of China, both found among policy elites and the general American public. American public now, 2/3 of Americans, have unfavorable views of China. So while I think there will be some positive changes that China will welcome, in terms of some of the things that I mentioned before about, bringing back the interagency, probably restoring the dialogues between the U.S. and China, having officials that will be empowered to engage Chinese officials. I think that the relationship, could get on more solid footing, but I will say that it will take Chinese participation, a much more proactive approach to the U.S.-China relationship in order to find that more solid footing. Often I find, and I've spent a long time working on U.S.-China relations, Chinese side tends to be more reactive, waiting for the U.S. To move forward on policy and then deciding how it will react. And I think if China is not ready to proactively address the real challenges and problems in the U.S.-China relationship, rolling up our sleeves on both sides and finding a way to get to a mode of solving problems, then I think that in a year or a year and a half, we could find our way back to once again, real strains in the U.S.-China relationship. China has, I'll wrap up. This is my last point.
Okay.
China has agency in the relationship, and it will need to take agency to be more proactive in addressing these fundamental issues. Chinese think tanks like the Carnegie-Tshinghua Center in Beijing, can contribute to that effort by putting forward policy ideas, by engaging with the government, both in China and the US, in helping think through where progress can be made in the US-China relationship. Let me end there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. I mean, the themes that are emerging, one is the revolving door, and the diversity of the panel reflects the difference of opinion on whether it's good or bad. I tend to agree with you and David on that, and have some specific examples. Diversity in terms of funding and in terms of the nature and type of think tanks, especially in China, is rather limited. One set of institutions and a narrow set of issues that they're focused on. And so diversity in that sense would greatly benefit China. And thank you for your comments in that regard. Dan Ikenson is director of the Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. And I want to pause and suggest that you have on this panel a wealth of those who are a part of the revolving door, examples of that, but also of the diversity and range of opinions and perspectives on U.S. Policy represented on the panel. And so, Dan?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Henry, for the invitation to join this panel. It's an excellent panel. I've learned quite a bit just sitting here listening. Let me tell you a little bit about the Cato Institute. We're a public policy research organization, a think tank that was founded in 1977. And our scholarship is basically committed to the ideals of free markets, limited government, individual liberty, and international peace. People often, the media in particular, refer to us as libertarian or free market oriented think tank. And our objective is to seek to limit the role of government in the economic and fiscal realm, as well as in the social and civil realms. So we advocate for solutions that expand the scope for a flourishing civil society and that limit the role of government. And how do we do that? We write newspaper articles, op-eds, magazine articles, policy papers, white papers, books. We testify before Congress and agencies of the administrative branch of the government. We meet with policymakers and their staff. We host forums and conferences like this one. And we speak to business groups, to student groups, to foreign delegations who are visiting and are interested in policy. The funding for Cato comes primarily from private individuals. Something like 85% comes from individuals who share our worldview, our values. They like what we have to say. They pay us to say it louder. We're not paid to take or advocate any specific policy positions, and we're proud of that. We're also nonpartisan. That means that we are, unlike a lot of think tanks that are associated with one of the major political parties or the other, we're not. We're critical of both Democrats and Republicans when they have policies that sort of run afoul of our ideas. And I suppose for that reason, the revolving door is not as alive and well as Paul put it for Carnegie at Cato as it is at Carnegie and Brookings. There are some Cato scholars who've been in government and out of government, but it's much less prevalent at Cato than at other places. But again, we're also supportive of Democratic and Republican policies that advance the ideals that we believe in. So as Jim said, I'm the director of the Center for Trade Policy Studies. I've been at Cato for 20 years. And I have to say these past 4 years have been the most unusual. Trump is certainly an unorthodox president. He deviates from 85 years of U.S. presidential history. Presidents from both parties supported trade liberalization over the years, and the institutions that underpinned trade liberalization, they dabbled in protectionism here and there, but it was more the exception than the rule. President Trump saw protection as a way to make America great again. So exports as Team America's points, imports as the foreign team's points, the trade account as the scoreboard, and the deficit on that scoreboard meant that we're losing at trade, and our trading partner, we're losing because our trading partners are cheating. That said, and as has already been mentioned earlier, I don't think Biden's trade and broader economic policy toward China is likely to change very significantly, certainly not in the short term. In substance, I think Biden is kind of boxed in. President Trump stole the Democratic Party's playbook on trade by indulging in protectionism and by glorifying tariffs and focusing on things that were unusual for a nominal Republican, to do. President Biden, or President-elect Biden, campaigned as the tougher on China candidate. So it'll be very difficult for him to do anything dramatic anytime soon. The tone, I think, will certainly change. I think that there will be a greater expertise running the show, people who know how to be diplomatic and know how to get things done. The question is, what can get done? I think Biden may eliminate some of the tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs, but probably not too many of them. The good news is that the China tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs, expire by statute in 2022. That may be what we're looking at in terms of getting rid of those tariffs. The defining feature of the U.S.-China relationship, though, is not the trade war. It's not these tariffs. It's the ongoing battle for what I call the battle for technological preeminence. And there is likely to be continuity with respect to the U.S. technology policy toward China. The export controls, the investment restrictions, the blacklisting of Huawei and other Chinese technology companies. And that's because U.S. concerns about technology and cybersecurity predate the Trump administration. Trump was just pretty boisterous, pretty loud, pretty bellicose about things. But these matters, as Paul and David can probably attest to, were very much on the radar of the previous administration, the Obama administration. And even before that, the George W. Bush administration was aware of China's indigenous innovation policies and other industrial technology policies that had as a goal the idea of sort of leapfrogging the West to the technological fore. And I think things changed maybe, when we hit the Great Recession, the depths of the Great Recession, there was a lot of introspection in the United States and a lot of focus on recognizing that China is a competitor in this space and that China is not just content to be the world's manufacturing floor. It has some real ambitions. And had Hillary Clinton won the presidency, I think we would be seeing a similar tack with respect to technology. I'm not sure the best way to deal with this. It seems that China is committed to, and understandably, to wanting to be the technologically preeminent economy in the world. The United States wants to stay there, and to me that foreshadows an absence of cooperation. It used to be the case that you were able to cordon off the economics and the trade from the geopolitics, from the ideological issues, from foreign policy differences, from human rights issues, because the economic relationship was so important. The pot of gold on the other side of the rainbow was so enticing. But things have changed, and I think it will be the centerpiece of the Biden administration's economic policy and trade policy will be what we do with respect to China. A lot of these technologies have first mover advantages, not only in the commercial space, but intelligence, security, military. So the China relationship, the tech battle, is a matter of national security. And I think ensuring security is the primary responsibility of government. And politicians don't ever want to be on the wrong side of questions about national security. So there is broad bipartisan support in Washington and among the U.S. public for policies that are aimed at depriving China and Chinese companies of access to U.S. technology for these reasons and out of these concerns. Alas, the U.S. and Chinese economies are interdependent. They're part of the same technology supply chain, and I think that interdependence, given the adversarial nature of the relationship in that space, could provide the rationale for curbing punitive policies and finding ways to cooperate, because the alternatives to getting along are going to be very disruptive and very costly. If you remember the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which has long served as a deterrent, perhaps some formulation of MAD can induce cooperation in this tech space, and we could build trust and further cooperation from there. But as of now, I think U.S. policy favors decoupling over cooperation, and that may be the right conclusion. I don't know. The U.S., Chinese, and global public should be made aware of the benefits of this approach, this kind of decoupling, because we're going to be flipping the bill, a very large bill for the lack of cooperation. So let me just close and say that while it should be understood that while many Americans have taken issue with Trump's trade war, with the tariffs over the past couple of years, there seems to be this broad bipartisan support for the efforts to deprive China, especially Huawei, of access to U.S. technology. But again, throughout the Trump administration, it has been really Congress, Republican members and Democrats, pushing Trump, not the other way around, to get tough on these technology restrictions. So that, to me, suggests that we are going to see continuity in that space. And that's roughly where things stand now and for the foreseeable future. So I'll stop there and thank you for your time.
All right, Dan, just one quick follow-on question. Any advice for Chinese think tanks from your perspective in years of working with them?
No, it's absolutely imperative to get as much information as you can, to engage in as many exchanges as possible with people in other think tanks, not only in China, but across the world. You need to corroborate your findings, test your a prioris, understand how people in other think tanks operate and get their ideas before policymakers. And so to the extent that you're able to do that and to exercise as much freedom as possible to find the truth, that is the way to be an effective thinker at a think tank.
Thank you. Terry Miller is the director of the Center for International Trade and Economics at the Heritage Foundation. Terry? Terry, you're muted or not here.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, there we go.
And thank you, Henry, for hosting this. I've learned a lot from the other speakers already. I want to start with a few comments about the structure of a think tank, and particularly about the structure of the Heritage Foundation, because one of the themes we've heard about so far is diversity of funding. And one of the things we benefit from in the Heritage Foundation is we have about 500,000 individual donors that are providing the financial resources. We do not depend on government funding at all. We have a very modest amount of corporate funding. So we have probably several thousand high-value donors, and then we have several 100,000 more modest donors. And that provides us with an incredible amount of diversity in terms of our funding streams and stability in those streams, because if one group of people don't like the things we say, then there's somebody else who probably does like the things we're saying. And the resources have been very stable in terms of supporting our work. Another thing, though, is that the fundraising efforts of the Heritage Foundation are very just separate from the research and policy promotion activities that we do. It's not quite a firewall. There's not a complete separation, but there's a very strong separation between what our researchers do and what our fundraisers do. And that, again, means that we are not beholden to our donors. We're not beholden to a government that's giving us resources. We're not beholden to individuals who are giving us resources to tell us what to think or what to do in our activities. And I think that's a very great strength for think tanks, that probably make some of my colleagues on this panel a little bit jealous, I think, but I'll leave that part at that. Now, what do we do with these resources? Well, I think to see our priorities right now, you can see how we've tried to adjust to the challenges of COVID-19. And one of the things we've done, obviously, is make huge investments in building up our multimedia activities, our interactions with the press, what we do online, how we have maintained the quality of our infrastructure, our digital infrastructure, and make sure that we're on the front lines in terms of the technology that we employ and the methods that we use that, with which we, how we employ that technology. So we made huge investments in that area. Conversely, we've made a huge investment in a new institute in our foundation that looks at the broadest kinds of philosophical and I guess you'd call it government theory, to make sure that the principles that underline our work are on very solid ground and that we're staying at the forefront of developments in democratic theory, economic theory, and the philosophy of government. So we made a big investment there. And then we've created yet another institute to handle technology policy. And this falls right into the China area, of course, because that's one of the major areas of friction between our two societies right now. And we've made a big investment in trying to make sure that we're on the forefront of that. So those are the three areas where we are really adjusting in response to current developments, trying to make sure that we can stay a first-rank think tank and still have some influence. The revolving door is obviously going to affect the Heritage Foundation, but in a somewhat different way than it's affecting some of these other institutes. We're going to be on the receiving end of government officials, and probably not very much on the providing end, sending our own scholars into the government. That's because we're on the more conservative side of the American political divide, and so we've had a lot of our former scholars working in the Trump administration, and in a Biden administration, it's not likely that he would be coming to the Heritage Foundation to staff up. So I do think that the revolving door, though, is a very important factor. It's important that the ideas and expertise from the think tank communities make their way into government. And it's equally important that the information expertise of government officials be drawn into the think tanks. It helps keep our work grounded in the practicalities of what it means to govern a modern society, and keeps us tethered to reality, I would say, so that we can have some influence and don't become just a think tank that does nothing but think. We like to think in ways that ultimately can affect government policy in a positive way, and through government policies affect the livelihoods of individuals in positive ways. I join with Dan in emphasizing that much of what we do in our society and much of what we think about in the Heritage Foundation is aimed not so much at influencing government, though that's a big part of it, but also influencing what's done in the private sector in the United States and in our civil society in the United States, because these are indeed the main ways in which Americans interact with each other are not through our government, but they're through all the other institutions in our society. So we like to believe that we are influencing those as well. What's going to happen with China? I realize we're getting a little short on time here, so let me turn to China and the Chinese American relationship going forward. One of our main priorities, and again, something else new that we have done, is establish something we call the China Transparency Project. That's because, frankly, we don't know all that much about what's going on in China, or at least we're not that confident about what we think we know. And we want to make sure we're reaching out, trying to tap all the information sources that we possibly can, so that the things that we do wind up thinking about China are based in reality and not on someone's opinion or our own ideas that perhaps have gotten stale or outmoded over time. So I think it's very important for think tanks to try to push all the time to get more information and to build up those institutions of society and government that can provide that information. Some of the most important information gathering institutions in the world right now are under tremendous stress from COVID-19, among other things. Even organizations like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank are under tremendous stress in terms of their own information gathering abilities. We collaborate with them all the time in my own work. I produce an index of economic policies in countries around the world, and we interact very closely with both the World Bank and the IMF, and they're under tremendous pressure to try to maintain the information flows, and that's in some respects reflects problems in governments around the world that they're having in adjusting, but also in those institutions themselves. So I think building the database is a very important thing that we and think tanks all over the world do as a contribution to debate, to policy making. China, I deal a lot with trade. What's going to happen on the trade front? I think we have been in an aberrant period. I did not support much of the Trump administration's policies on trade, which I thought were aggressive in a way that didn't produce positive results either for the American people or for China particularly. But they do reflect the political reality in the United States, and it's a bipartisan reality that people believe that trade deficits are important, and they believe that the imbalance in trade that we have had with our flows with China historically may have some negative repercussions for the United States. I'm not sure that's entirely true, and we've pushed back in many ways on that idea, but nonetheless, it's a view that's widely held. It's not going to change in a Biden administration. And I don't think the economic policies are going to change wildly. I do think that we'll get away in a Biden administration from this broad application of tariffs and perhaps go to a much more specific kind of application of various policy issues. But the main tensions on the economic front are going to be there, particularly as societies like the United States are trying to recover employment. We're going to hear a lot about jobs, and when you hear about jobs, you're going to hear a lot about jobs lost through trade. That may not be accurate. It's something a think tank can push back against, but nonetheless, that's an important political factor in the US. And that's going to mean we're not going to see a radical departure from the protectionist inclinations, I would say, that have been present over the last 4 years. But just the last point I want to make is that a lot about what happens between China and the United States going forward depends not just on the United States, it depends on China and what happens in China and the attitudes of the Chinese administration and the attitudes of the Chinese people as well. China, I frequently tell people that the China of today is not the China of our parents, or certainly not the China of our grandparents. And there's a Chinese middle class, there's a Chinese professional class, there's a technocratic class. There are a lot of people in China that are in a position to have influence on the government, even though the government is certainly not what we would regard as a democracy and in the way we're accustomed to that. But nonetheless, it's a government that does have to respond to the opinions and needs of the people of China. And the think tank community in China, I'm so positive on the developments of that community because they provide, in many ways, a vehicle through which the needs and the views of the Chinese people can be made known to their government. And of course, that's one of the main roles of a think tank, is to take the views of academics, of people in all walks of life, and to translate that into ways that can have an impact in a positive way on government policy. That's what we do here in the United States, and I think that's a role that all the think tanks in China could aspire to as well. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. There is great diversity on the panel, but there's also a fair degree of agreement in terms of what will change and what will not change in U.S. policy. I now turn and want very much to have on the panel a voice from China, and there's no better voice than the partner that I've been working with for some time, Henry Wang at the Center for China and Globalization. Henry?
Okay, thank you, Jim, and all the distinguished panelists. I think this is really timely and a very, very important discussion. Actually, at the after the U.S. election and after the G20 just finished the last night. So I think this is great, and CCG is very pleased to work with TSP to organize this event, as we actually want to be a bridge and platform for the China and outside world. As a matter of fact, we just concluded a conference, our 6th annual conference of CCG annual conference last week ago, and we had we invited a number of international experts to come, including John Thornton and Graham Allison, Tom Friedman, Wolfgang Ischinger, and Pascal Lamy, and just to name a few. So what I would like to say is that currently we have this open dialogue. We have about, now sitting in this room, we have at the UPenn Wharton Center, there's about 150 think tank scholars, business leaders, and academics, and all walks of life on a policy front. So it's really great. And also, I just watched online. We have over already in this such an early morning about 500,000 viewers online or listeners online already. So this is a great exchange. I would like just to say a few points just to echo what has been said, discussed. First of all, I think that probably correct that Biden may not be going back to the previous administration policy, because China has changed. China has already developed. China has actually, economically, in all front, has actually developed so fast. And also China's attitude to the globalization has been also reshaped a bit as well. So I think that is probably true. So that's number one. Number two is that I think that U.S. and China has to really work together, because this COVID-19 for the last year really demonstrated how important, how vital that U.S. and China has to work together to really, contain the virus and let world not get into recession. So I think China has done relatively well now. China's contained the virus. The fact that we can hold this conference here, without really any big disruption is really good evidence of that. But I think it's important that we get U.S., EU, Japan, ASEAN, many other countries to work together to really through the WHO and others to really contain this. Otherwise, we're going to have a continuous deterioration of the global economy, and no country is an island. China cannot just survive by itself. So that's my second point. I think the third point I would like to emphasize is as a matter of fact, we see a reboot or a reviving of a multilateralism, or at least the regional multilateralism. For example, about a week ago, China has just signed RCEP, 15 countries, ASEAN plus China and Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. We just signed the RCEP. It's the largest free trade agreement in the world now. So I think that's really a great beginning. Also, we know that President-elect Biden will come back to the climate change, which is it has to be a multilateral effort. And he said he's going to come to the first day of the Paris Accord. As a matter of fact, we met. Actually, I'm glad to see also tonight that John Kerry has been nominated the envoy of the climate change by President-elect Biden. And he was attended the CCG official event at the Munich Security Conference. And he said how he had actually engaged with China, with Chinese government, with President Xi, and take many times for discussing and actually recommended China to join Paris Accord. So I'm glad to see he's coming back. And I'm sure that President Xi mentioned at the UN summit that by 2060, China will be carbon neutral, which is a huge objective that China is going to achieve. And so the countdown time is tickling now. So I think that's a great that China and US can work together again. And also, as a matter of fact, we see that just 2 days ago, President Xi announced that China is interested at the APEC summit. China is interested to join CPTPP, which is CPTPP is designed and actually largely promoted by the US before Trump abandoned it. But I guess maybe this was signed during the Obama-Biden administration. Possibility that I see some US scholars recommending Biden come back. So it's great. Now, if we have both channels, platforms to talk, also through CPTPP, then we have a more multilateralism reviving, more regional integration going on. So that's really great. And China also is talking with EU now about trying to finalize the China-European investment, comprehensive investment treaty by the end of this year. So we see that happening. And the WTO reform, we hope Biden comes up. We're not blocking the appointment of the Director General. And so that maybe China, US and EU, we could have some trilateral talks and then tackling on the climate change, tackling on the pandemic fighting. And I can even suggest, which is number 4 point I'm making, is why can't we have a G7 plus China and Russia and India have a G10 summit for vaccine summit? Because I think if the world is really going to get out of the pandemic crisis, we have to rely on the vaccine. And most of the vaccine manufacturers, multinational, based in those 10 countries. So we can do that. So, and also climate change summit. The G10 country produce 6 of them, the largest polluters in the world, and represents half of the world population. It's more effective, efficient. Maybe let's Biden and others, we can have a G10 summit to tackle this issue. Finally, I agree with the panelists that we need some new thinking. We need some new narrative. I think that's the think tank community, exactly we have to do, including China. So it's great to have this think tank whole day summit. We're going to talk about that. I think we need a new narrative because what has China has been doing in the last number of years? China has been lifting 800 million people out of poverty and contributed 1/3 of the world GDP growth. Now it's the leading economy putting the world through the pandemic crisis. So China has done many things right. But we probably need to take a fresh look at how China can achieve that, but also mindful of what people outside China are not really critical about other aspects. And China can always in improvement. China is always developing. China never satisfied. China is always wants to have the collaborating with other countries. So I think that is really great that think tank can work together. I really think that one of the examples we are having this conference today. So I want to stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay. Henry, if I could indulge and ask each one of the panel in a 30-second lightning round, where if you could suggest one area for potential collaboration and cooperation between China in the coming years? What would that be?
So you ask me? Yeah?
No, not you.
Okay.
The panelists. We can go in reverse. Terry, your mic is muted.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
And each person has to be quick.
Yeah. I would like for the United States and China to get away from this great power idea of great power competition. I think that's extremely destructive. And the best future for all of us would be to have a United States and China that were friendly competitors, but in a cooperative way, and did not see themselves in any way as adversaries or countries to be overcome or to be challenged in one way or another.
Okay. Dan?
Well, I see the biggest problem as this technology, this race for technological preeminence. If there's a way for the Chinese government and the US government to sort of come clean, to describe what are the costs, where is the evidence that these technologies that we are trying to restrain each other from getting are going to lead to an insurmountable advantage for one side or the other. We're talking about $12 to $13 trillion by 2035 of 5G products sold around the world that are going to be bifurcated if we don't come to some agreement about these things soon. So don't make us incur these costs. If we're going to have to incur these costs, at least share with us the information that makes this so pertinent. So something devoted to opening up and sharing information.
Okay. Paul?
Well, I wouldn't jump to cooperation so quickly. I think we've got problems in the relationship that we have to solve, and I think we have to find, for the first time ever, really, a mode at solving problems. As I said before, rolling up our sleeves and showing the American people, showing the Chinese people, where we have disagreements, we can actually come together where each side makes compromise and concessions. But it's going to take much more self-reflection on both sides. The narratives in the US and China are diametrically opposed. They're completely different. In China, it's all about the Thucydides trap. China's getting stronger and the United States doesn't like it. It's not about anything that China is doing. It's all about what America is doing to China. And I don't think that's really accurate. And I hope that there is some acknowledgement of the concerns that the United States has. And a good place to start would be for China to look around the world and see where attitudes are hardening against China because of China's policies, actions, and behaviors, and recognize that it's not just a US phenomenon that policy is hardening. It is becoming international. And so more reflection and more of an attempt to try to address these critical issues.
All right, David?
I think an important place for us to work together is on this emerging debt crises of developing countries following the COVID pandemic and the global recession. As I mentioned briefly, China is the largest official creditor, though actually the private sector, private bondholders are the biggest creditors for poor developing countries. China's the biggest official creditor. The United States, we've blocked the IMF from increasing its resources and made it difficult for the IMF to be helping out. So what you have right now is a lack of cooperation between China and the US, and the end result is a lot of poor developing countries getting further and further into economic crisis. So I think that, to me, work on something practical, which is in our mutual interest, because otherwise we're going to have a wave of economic crises around the developing world. Yeah, that'll just
Great.
be bad.
Thank you. Is Emma still with us or no?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so in the national security realm, I think the thing we need to cooperate on is learning to understand one another and understanding intentions. I think both Washington and Beijing are very good at understanding the military capabilities that both sides have and responding to that. We're not nearly so good at understanding intentions. And I think that is the biggest risk factor for both sides going forward. So we need to get a lot better about talking about areas of common concern, areas where we might come into tension, without just talking about the capabilities, the military capabilities that we have to deal with it.
Okay, thank you very much. A few points. The revolving door, I would underscore the value of that, and I would provide the illustration if you look closely at the 9/11 Commission. The U.S., that commission was one of the most important commissions in terms of examining a critical issue in the United States. It was largely driven by think tanks and those who were a part of the revolving door. The 2008 economic crisis was, I think, supported and diminished as a result of the role the think tanks played at a critical moment in the transition between two administrations. And I would suggest that we now have another instance where relying on experts and the revolving door will be critical in the transition in these two administrations. Additionally, my wish for China is that if just every Chinese citizen would give 1 yuan to support think tanks in China, China would be better off as a result of that, and would have the diversity in terms of the range of institutions and opinions that is really truly in China's national interest, both in the short term and the long term. What a wonderful panel, what a range of opinions. I hope that our colleagues in China are able to take advantage of the views that have been expressed. Thank you, panelists one and all.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And I think we had a very good discussion. And one final comment I can make, in addition to the climate change and also pandemic fighting, probably on the infrastructure that China and US can work together, because Trump wants to do infrastructure, so maybe that's one area. So I think we have successfully concluded our panel, morning opening panel. And I want to thank again on behalf of the organizer, all the panelists. And I think we're having a break now. We're going to have a whole day football events coming up online here and offline here. So thank you again.